when I was a kid, we had 3 schools up there that I went to. One was the Hatton School, and one was what we called the Kiefer School, and the other one was the original Genevieve School. So.
Oh, really? I think we actually got a picture of the Kiefer School as well.
I can tell you who all those kids were.
Was that Gertrude that taught there?
Well, Gertrude taught 1 year, and there was a Swalheim taught one year. I think just 2 years is all more of that school was open there. They decided they needed to bunch of those schools together, so that's what they wound up with.
So that Kiefer School, that was right on that corner to turn to the hall, wasn't it?
Yep.
That was the old Kiefer hot place where the Kiefers
That
lived?
was the old, and I don't know who those Kiefers were. They were people that were gone before I remember. Hmm. They moved that house down here where the city pump is now.
Oh, really?
And then I think Sherman Laycock finally tore the thing down.
Oh.
That's the one I went to school in.
What was the Genevieve School like? Was it just a one room?
Pretty much. Of course, this Kiefer School, that was all they used was just one room in it. There was a half a dozen rooms in it, so upstairs, and there was a basement under it. That Genevieve School, that was, well, all the schools we went to up there were all summer schools because it's too damn cold in the wintertime to be running around get kids to school. So as soon as the weather got bad, well, they shut the schools down. So
a little bit different than it is now.
Well, you got whatever education was available, I guess, and when we were going to the Genevieve School, I think I was in the first grade when I started up there, and rode a horse up. Mother used to put me on the horse when I left the house, and the teacher took you off when you got up to school. And then Hatton School, I think that was about 4 miles to that one, and I think we rode a horse over there. And the Kiefer School, we had we went over there in a buggy. We had an old buggy horse. My granddad Mogan had one anyway, and that's what we used to. 1 year, just 1 year we went to buggy, and then after that I think we rode over.
How many siblings did you have?
Well, I had just one brother when we were going to school at that time. The sister, she was born somewhat later.
So which school was the best?
Well, that Kiefer School was, because we had a lot of girls to go to school with over there. Genevieve school, I think there was Hilda Johnson, I think, was the only girl that went up there, and she was quite a bit older than I was, so. And then there was a kid by the name of Cliff O'Connell, and he was probably full-blooded Indian if you'd got into his history in a way. And he never lived with any of his folks. His dad was a Jack O'Connell, and his mother was Gladys something or other. But the Valentines were neighbors of ours, and Mrs. Valentine, she might have been a full-blood. Old John Valentine, the dad, I think he was an Irishman. And this Mrs. Valentine, as I remember her, I think she cooked for all the goddamn grub riders in the country, because there was Valentine's, there was a couple of older boys, and of course they always had friends, and they were, when they'd come through, they'd always stay overnight, so Mrs. Valentine would feed them, and they took the horse out to the barn, and you had to feed the horses if they were going to stay overnight and water them, so yeah, that was quite a hangout, that Valentine place. Johnny Valentine was, I guess you could about said, one of my best friends. He worked for Claire Duncan up there. In fact, he rode for the summer herd in that country for years. And he was living with Claire Duncan, I guess. But he was probably one of the nicest Native Americans I think anybody was ever lucky enough to know. He finally moved into Malden, and he was living up there, and anytime I went to Malden, I'd always tell Agnes I got to go over and visit John a few minutes before I go home, and 2 hours later I was always still there. He was the damnedest storyteller you could imagine. And I don't know if he ever told me the same one twice or not. If he did, he probably didn't recognize it, so. Well, a lot of those guys, I guess I shouldn't say that, were horse thieves. There was no doubt about it, but one thing those guys, if they were horse thieves, they never stole from the neighbors.
It probably wouldn't last very long if you stole from your neighbors. They'd probably get you pretty quick.
If you were going to get along with them, I guess if you stole a horse, you didn't have the stolen horse next door, so you had to do something else with it. And this Johnny Valentine, as I was just a kid at the time, and they were about a mile from us, I guess, and he'd be going to the Missouri, which was out south here, And I had no idea how damn far off. I didn't know what the Missouri was, whether it was a goddamn river or range of mountains or what it was. It was just a name. Well, him and about 3 or 4 other people had a kind of a robber's roost down there in the Missouri. It was an area where I think they were living in a dugout, and I don't think there was even a decent wagon trail to get in and out of that place. A friend of mine from Malta, he had one of the guys he worked with was an old brand inspector, and he'd been down there on the Missouri, and he was trying to catch these guys. He knew they were eating Etchart meat because they didn't have that was all they had to eat around there, and those guys would pick up horses, saying Canadian horses, that they'd bring through this country, and they'd take them down to this area they had, and they'd swim them across the Missouri. That was before the dam was in, and the Missouri was just a river. And as soon as you got them down into Macomb County, I guess I'd made an honest horse out of them then, so. And then they'd steal horses down there, and they'd come up and they'd go through this country, and once they got them into Canada, well then I guess I'd made an honest horse out of them up there, so.
They figured no one was crazy enough to drive them that far, huh?
Well, they weren't going to haul them because there were no trucks to haul them. Anytime anybody moved anything, that's the way you just got in behind them and trailed them.
Were there any wild horses around?
Well, that's a kind of a whole different story. Somebody got smart in this country years ago, and after the homesteaders had starved out, and a lot of those people just, when Fort Peck started, they got a few dollars and they left the country, and they just turned their work on their saddle horses out. And they were just scattered around the goddamn country. Well, back before my time, somebody got smart and they decided they better get rid of all of those goddamn horses that were floating around this country. So they started at the Canadian line, and they got a bunch of young punk cowboys, and they'd bring those things in, and they'd corral them, say, at Hinsdale, and they'd notify people, we got all of these horses in here, and if you got any in there, you better come and get them, because anything that isn't picked up or going, they were canning the things, and they'd ship them. I don't know where they were shipping them, someplace to can them. So that cleaned the country out. And you get down there in the Pryor Mountains, and they never done that. Those goddamn wild horses. In fact, the BLM, I think, are still feeding them stupid things down there. And there's a feedlot in Lovell, Wyoming, and any of those horses they can't get rid of, that's where they wind up. And they got vets down there taking good care of them to be sure there's nothing wrong with them, to keep them alive. And only one way they can get out of there, they eventually die of old age, I guess. I don't know how many horses they've got in that country, but it's costing hundreds of thousands of dollars just to feed the stupid things. Well, we're goddamn lucky in this country. Somebody was smart enough to clean this country out and get rid of them before, or else we'd have had the same mess as they got in the prior mountains. I never did know who to give credit for that. Somebody did the smart thing. They had a bunch of them out south, and they did the same thing out there. They got a bunch of those young cowboys, and they bring them in, and they'd probably bring them into Hinsdale or probably Van Day or Tampico, any of those places that had a stockyard. And then they'd tell people to come, if there's any of these things you want, you better come and get them. Well, those ones that are in the prior mountains, they claim they're wild horses, but hell, there wasn't any wild horses in this country back then. If there had been, the Indians would have already picked them up and were using them for their own use. All those ones that they got down there is some stuff that was, the ranchers just turned out and kicked them out. And there was no sale for them, so they opened up the corral gate and turned them out and let them go. So a lot of people this day and age, if they got a horse, they don't even brand it, because if they want to get rid of it, you can't. There's no sale for them. You can't legally can a horse anymore. So what in the hell are you going to do with them? They just turn them out, and if you don't have a brand on, then nobody knows who in the hell they belong to. So
Yeah, they're treated as pets now instead of work animals.
well, they're worthless as far as I'm concerned, and the legislature made the mistake when they got those things declared an endangered species in the first place. And when you make a mistake, it looks to me like eventually you should be able to straighten it out, but I guess you never can.
Were there still any sheep men around when you were young?
Everybody in this country started out with sheep. You go back far enough. And most of them stayed in the sheep as long as they could get decent sheep herders, but then it finally got to the point there wasn't enough old drunks that wanted to be sheep herders, so pretty hard to stay in the sheep business when you don't have a sheep herder.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there wasn't but one or two ranchers in this country that didn't start out in the sheep business. I think old Frank Jones, I think, was one that never was in the sheep business. Cornwell's, I know they started out in the sheep business. Etcharts were sheep people.
Yeah, I heard the old timers would say when the times got tough, you sold the cows and kept the sheep because you got 2 paychecks and they could live off nothing.
Well, that's just about what it amounted to. People would get tired of fighting the goddamn sheep herders and get rid of the sheep and go into the cow business. Then if they got hard up, they'd have to go back into the sheep business again. So they get out of debt. So.
I think it was Frances Barton wrote in one of her memoirs that people preferred the sheep in the dry periods because when the sheep ran out of grass, they just stayed quiet, but the cows would make a lot of noise.
Well, Bartons were sheep people to start out with. They were neighbors of ours up there. Frances Barton was a near dear friend of mine over the years, and they her and Henry Barton started out, I think they were 5 or 6 miles from the Canadian line, right, well, if you know where that Duncan place is, it was north of that. And that, John and Roger, the 2 boys they had up there, I think Mrs. Barton probably taught those kids to start out with. And then after they got a little age, well then she came down to Genevieve and I don't know whether they bought that Genevieve store. You go back, as I remember it anyway.
Yeah, I actually have a couple picture of the boys in front of the store. Came from one of their memoirs.
Well, that store was built as a co-op store, and I think the co-op was out of Saco. Yeah, we were, what was it, 3 miles from, if I wanted to play with any kids, I had to walk up there and play with Roger and John, so.
Do you remember going into the store?
Oh yeah, right so mighty, yeah, I think when we were going to school at Kiefer's, which was 2 miles east of there, I think we used to always stop at the Barton store part of the time we were on the buggy and part of the time we were saddle horse, but well, she had I don't remember, it was 2 or 3 mail routes that come in there. One out of Saco, one out of Hinsdale, and one out of Teeny. And then they had 2 telephones come in there that weren't hooked together. One out of Hinsdale and one out of Saco. Somebody would, in the Hinsdale area, would want to talk to somebody in Saco. They'd call Mrs. Barton and then she'd have to relay the call for you, so.
Did you guys ever have a telephone?
Well, later years, we didn't have, not in early days we didn't. Some of those old telephones, they run the telephone line on the fence post with an insulator on them. And if the cow or the horse got to rubbing on it, well then you'd probably lose your connection, so. And those old phones, you had a deal on the wall about 1.5 feet square, and it had a speaker on it, and then you had a crank on the side, and when you wanted to call somebody, you could ring a short ring, which was 1 crank, or a long ring, which was 2, and so you had to remember what sequence you had to go through to get a hold of your neighbor, so. And they'd hear that, and then they'd go pick up the receiver, so.
I heard stories that there were a lot of, especially older folks, who just couldn't help the temptation to listen in on all the phone calls.
Oh, yes. That wasn't all early days. Later years, you had the same trouble when they first put the phones in, the modern phone. Well, you'd maybe have 2 or 3 people on the same line. So if one person was on it, you picked it up. Well, if there was somebody else on it, you just waited until they got through, or hoped they got through in a way.
So where was your guys' ranch? It was north of Genevieve?
Nope. Well, the home place was 3 miles from Genevieve, south, or north and west.
So it would have been there by that Grandma Road, they call it?
Well, that would have been my granddad Mogan's place over there, and that was, well, I guess that was about 3.5, 4 miles over there.
Hmm.
And the folks, early days, that's where they got their mail. The mail come out of Hinsdale, and any personal mail was dropped off at Grandma and Grandpa Mogan's, and then in the wintertime, weather got right and you needed to read the paper and see what you got for mail, and then you'd go get on your saddle horse and take a gunny sack along and put your mail in a gunny sack and bring it home. So,
So everyone would stop by and visit your grandparents, huh?
well, I'm sure they did. They weren't right on the mail route. They were off about a mile, I guess. So I think Grandma used to have to walk over to the main road, I think, to pick the mail up. So there was a hell of a lot of people afoot back in that day and age. Wasn't anybody had a car. Few of them had a buggy, but well, Granddad Mogan, he bought a Model T, one of those, I forget what they call them. They had the canvas, everything was canvas except the running gears, I guess. So, and he was scared to death of the damn thing. I think he drove it once or twice and decided he didn't, he'd rather have a team anyway, so he parked the thing in a goddamn old coal shed up there, and I think it sat there for probably 25 or 30 years. And then when we got a little bit bigger, we decided we should get the damn thing running, so we got it running, and before we got to, we cut the back off, put a box on it, and when we got through, it wasn't much of a Model T anymore.
Good for running around, though, I'm sure.
Well, we used it a little, all right, but that would have been worth a lot of money if it had been left in there and taken care of instead of wrecked later.
Did you guys use coal for heat, or?
Well, this place that we were on south of the house about 2.5 miles was a damn coal mine. And so I remember him and the neighbors used to get together in the fall and they'd go dig coal, and this coal mine was in, there was a pretty good bank, had a pretty good slope to it. So when you started at the bottom, you probably only had maybe 2 or 3 feet of dirt. Well, every time you went back a couple more feet, well, then you got a whole hell of a lot more dirt. So it finally got to the point, I guess it wasn't hardly worth digging. You had to move too much dirt. They had to get a team and a Fresno down in there to get rid of the dirt. Yeah, where we were, we hardly ever burned much wood. There wasn't any trees up there in the first place, so there was a coal mine up there at Opheim. There might still even be one up there. And then there was another one in Rock Creek. And I think there used to be maybe 3 or 4 people used to go over there and mine that coal out of that seam years ago. Well, this one old guy, I don't know if that was Davis or Dieter or what his name was. Well, everybody else had left. Well, so he crawled back. They were undermining this thing, and so he goes back in there and was going to take a few more pieces of coal home with it, and the thing fell in and killed him. So
It's a pretty horrible accident.
what's that?
Pretty horrible accident.
Well, I guess people were used to having deaths back in that day and age. There was another old guy up. Well, it was across from McCauley's and over there on some stuff that we had, and he was working on some old steel wheel tractor. He was working alone, obviously, and he was taking this steel wheel off of this thing, and he had his back to it, and he was pulling this goddamn steel wheel off the thing, and when it come off, well, it fell over backward on him, and he laid there under that thing. I didn't know how long, and he finally died under there. So
Those things are heavy.
well, if you're on your back under them, yeah, and they were made out of steel. I forget what that guy's name was.
Do you remember the old Qualley Cemetery up there by the Qualley place?
Well, I can tell you just exactly where it is, yep. There's Bob Darkman and I, a friend of mine from Helena, stopped out there the last time. And the thing has got a pretty good metal fence around it, and there are some graves in there with some markers on them, so you get some idea about who's buried up there.
Do you remember anyone calling that the Jordan Cooley Cemetery?
Well, I've heard of Jordan. That might have been what they call that. There's no other cemetery up there, and that was Jordan Cooley that bunch of Norwegians were on. So that was probably what they called it. It could have been called the Qualley one, because Qualley was probably the closest there. That road used to come from McCauley's, and it was going pretty much right straight north, and then you finally could only go so far. You run into Qualley's fence, and then you had to turn and go toward where Grandma and Grandpa Mogan lived. So that was where that road was. And then later years, when the county put the new road in, then they kind of cut across that one piece of county land that was in there, not county, state land, north of that thing. And anyway, they shortened the road up quite a bit. Well, that was quite an undertaking years ago when they finally decided to build a good road in that north country. And then after they built the thing, then they even put gravel on it. So, Christ, those roads, when I was a kid, I can remember if it rained, you stayed home. And if you were in town and it rained, you either stayed there until you had to go home. And Christ, sometimes those people would have to go home, and they'd get 2 or 3 ranchers at a time. They'd all start out together, and if one got stuck, they always had somebody else to push him out.
Before they built that good road, did people go to Saco more than they went to Hinsdale?
Well, when Dad was freighting wheat from the home place up there, he used to freight to Beaverton. Beaverton was closer than Saco or Hinsdale, either one, so he must have used 4 horses, I guess, on one of those double wagon boxes. And I don't know whether he could make a trip down and back in a day or not. I guess I don't remember, but I can remember that was the way he was getting his wheat to town. Yeah, where Genevieve was, it didn't make a whole lot of difference. Saco and Hinsdale were just about, one was about the same as the other, so. Hinsdale had a lot better road later years, so that's the way you usually went, so. And before they put the Frenchman Dam in, there wasn't a decent way of getting across Frenchman. There was one crossing there, right there at Valley Town, and it had a real good way of getting in on the west side, or on the east side, and when, to get up the west side, the thing was pretty much straight up and down. Well, you had to get some of those old farmers around there with a team in Fresno and scrape the mud off of that one side before you get across there, so.
Was there much in Valleytown?
Well, not really, there never was. It was a post office, and this guy, they sold a few groceries there. And that was a pretty well-known place. You go back far enough when these outfits were traveling through the country, they'd be trailing horses or sheep or some goddamn thing, and that's where they'd stop and pick up a few supplies when they went through the country. They'd just stay far enough north where there was grass and just keep on going until they either had to shear the sheep or sell the lambs or whatever. Then they'd hit the railroad, so. Yeah, there's been a whole hell of a lot of changes made that I can remember, so.
It must have been pretty rough living back then.
Well, everybody was in the same boat. You didn't know how bad a shape you were in, so. I don't think anybody actually went hungry back then.
What did you guys eat a lot of? I'm guessing your mom cooked for you?
The what?
What would you eat?
Well, Mother canned a hell of a lot of stuff. She had, of course, you couldn't keep meat over the summer, so she always had canned beef, the biggest share of the time, and then in the summertime, she always raised chickens, so you got used to eating fried chicken, so.
That doesn't sound too bad.
Well, it wasn't. You always had beef in the wintertime. You wait till it got cold enough so when you butchered, the meat would freeze.
Were there any pigs in the country?
Well, my granddad Mogan, he was an old hog raiser. The folks, they didn't really get into that. They would, I think they'd get one or two from Grandpa Mogan and fatten up and butcher, but they weren't really into pig business.
I read somewhere that people really got into turkeys for a while.
Well, Mrs. Stuff, which they lived down there north of Bowman's, I think she used to raise quite a few turkeys, and then they claimed when the grasshoppers got bad, she'd take the turkeys out and run through the grain fields, feed the turkeys grasshoppers, and besides that, she kept the goddamn grasshoppers from eating the grain, so.
Were most people raising wheat?
Well, up until a few years ago, wheat was the cash crop. And that was, for some reason or other, it took them years to get out of the idea of raising wheat for a cash crop. Now they got all of those plus crops, so they're raising a half a dozen other ones now, so. Well, the way wheat is right now, I don't think you can hardly get enough out of the thing to even afford to hard to raise it for what little I've followed the market in a way.
Yeah, there's too much wheat in the bins.
Well, there is, and at least with some of these other crops now, at least they got something else to sell to pay some of their bills in a way.
Besides the store, what else was up at the Genevieve, like the town site?
Well, you'd have to go back before my time. I guess there was a blacksmith shop, I know. Old man Schuler had a blacksmith shop. I remember that, and then somebody said that one time there was a barber shop up there. And they had that dance hall, which is still there. And I don't know if there was ever any other businesses up there or not. It might have been before my time anyway.
Yeah, we're hoping at some time this fall to have another dance up there.
Well, they've been talking about it, but I think they finally got that hall kind of fixed back up again.
Yeah, they got some new tin, and I think they got about half of it on the roof.
Oh, did they? I didn't realize they were putting another roof on it, I guess.
Yeah, they got the roof on. Some years back, they put siding on it, and I think last summer, Matt Johnson crawled underneath it and fixed the floor.
Oh, well, that one corner in there, the water run off of the kitchen and run off the hall, and I don't think there's any drainage away from there, and I think it used to run in underneath there, and I suppose that was kind of hard on the floor joists.
What were the dances like up there?
Well, depends on how far back you go. Years ago, everybody either went with team and, if there was a family, most of them traveled team and wagon. And then in the kitchen there was a place about that high, and must have been 5 or 6 feet deep, And that's where they laid all the kids when they when they wanted them to shut up and go to sleep, I guess. Well, most of the music was local people. There was a hell of a lot of fiddle players in the country. And I can remember when I was a kid, they'd have a dance, say in the summertime, and you'd see riders riding across the country heading for Genevieve, and the thing I could remember, you could, before it got dark, you could see them all damn white shirts for miles. Everybody was on a saddle horse. We got up there and then they tied the saddle horses up and waited till they got sober enough so they could ride home.
I heard that Genevieve parties were known for all the fights that they had outside.
Well, there was a few of them, all right. Well, all of that, most of the things that I can remember in the real early days was just damn near all of it about prohibition. And you can't imagine the amount of goddamn alcohol that was floating around the country. We were close enough to Canada up there, and of course, alcohol was legal in Canada, so consequently, people were buying it up there and sneaking it into the United States, so I think of a few people up there, I think just about made a living during Prohibition. I don't know what year it was, but Dad he was thrashing alfalfa seed. He must have had, 2 or 3 guys there helping. They were pitching this alfalfa through an old combine. Well, I can remember some cowboy come riding in all excited, Prohibition was over. That must have been when Roosevelt got elected. And I don't know if they shut the goddamn machine down and had a celebration right then or not. They probably did.
Were there quite a few people running moonshine up in the country?
Well, there was a few making it, and there was a hell of a lot of them drinking it, but
I think it was Blanche told me that she remembers someone hiding it in the rock piles.
well, there was a neighbor of ours up north there, and he had a still, I know he did, and the federal people finally found out about it, and they went and tore his still all apart. I can remember part of that old still has blown around the country up there 2 or 3 or 4 years later, that some of the stuff that he'd built for this outfit. And I don't know what they were using, if they were using barley or what. You could buy malt in the grocery store, and the only goddamn use for it, I think, was making beer with it, so.
But it wasn't illegal to sell malt, just
Well,
the beer.
Cripes almighty no, there's only one use for it though, so it was still legal to sell it.
I think some of the companies back east, I remember reading a little article about it, they would sell concentrated grape juice, and they had a paper that said, "Do not put this in your bathtub with this much water and this much sugar because it will produce an illegal substance." Here's how to make it, but don't do it.
I say, remember Mrs. Barton telling about selling lemon extract. Some of those dances, apparently there was a little alcohol in it, so. Well, there was another family that had that store earlier. That was Fred Erickson. And he had, well, he must have had 3 or 4 kids, or maybe more than that. Well, he was Fred, I think, was an old fiddle player, if I remember right. I think he used to play for dances up there when he was running the store. Well, there was a lot of people in that country at one time. To start out with, there was somebody on just about every half section, but it didn't take too long to figure out that that wasn't enough to make a living on, so then they let people homestead what they call a desert claim. And you could homestead another half section, but you had to prove you could make water run on this damn thing or somewhere or other.
There's a lot of places up there that'd be pretty hard to get water on.
Well, they would put a dam in, and then there'd be a little, take a plow and plow down below the dam with a little trail, and I guess you could run water down it. Well, it wouldn't do any good, but.
Anything to get the land.
Yeah, well, they were, I think just about everybody, I think, eventually wound up with the desert. Well, Dad kind of lucked out. The place that he had, his sister Esther and husband had homesteaded there. That's the house that we lived in. And then when he got back in the service after World War I, well, then they opened up the land for the homesteading again. And then, of course, all the good land was pretty well used, taken at that time. Well, Esther, she had a half section and plus a desert claim, and Dad, he had a half section plus a desert claim. He had another sister, Melva, and she had a section plus a desert claim. And then he had a cousin, and that wasn't right in the same area, but that was further south, and he'd homesteaded. So Dad wound up with all of the relatives land that they had in a way, and then Granddad Mogan, he was farming that for his folks too, so. And then he bought another place, so he must have had 2.5 or 3 sections or something like that, I guess, which back in that day and age was a pretty good sized place, so.
He must have had some people helping him work it for how big that was.
He used to hire men, especially at harvest time, and during the hay, and he had some land on this creek that run by it. It had it had a pretty good bottom on it, and he could put some hay upon it. I gotta remember those guys, they were working for $30 a month, and I think during the harvest they probably got 40. And were tickled to death to get it. That was young single guys that was floating around. There were a lot of good men floating around. We were close enough to Canada. A lot of those Canadians were coming down to our part of the country. And they were wanting to get down and get on the old Great Northern Railroad so they could go east or west. So and I remember those people would stop in there. Of course, they were walking in the summertime. You had to give them something to drink and probably something to eat. And the thing I remember, she was scared to death of those people, but she probably wouldn't have had the men. I would imagine they were all pretty productive people if they'd had a job.
Do you know why so many people were coming down from Canada? Was it not good up there?
Well, they were in just the same shape. Everything dried out in the 30s. That was the biggest problem. There was a drought, and the price of grain really wasn't worth all that much either. So, I remember those goddamn storms coming, dust storms coming up. It looked like it was going to rain, but there never was any. The cloud was dirt moving, coming out of that triangle country, I guess, further west. And the goddamn dust would blow into everything. And I remember Mother had to light the goddamn lamps to see, and the goddamn chickens would all go to roost because they thought it was night, so. That sounds kind of far-fetched, but I definitely remember living through them, so.
Were there people that got sick from the dust?
I don't remember anybody getting sick from dust. They were born and raised in it, so I guess they were used to it. I don't know where the hell those goddamn windstorms came from. I don't remember. Perhaps we haven't had any of those for years and years. Of course, I guess if the dirt's already loose, maybe it don't take too many mile-an-hour wind to get it all up in the air, so.
There might not be dust, but I know there's still strong wind. It blew my mom's barn down twice.
Oh.
Got it half built and it blew it all the way over.
I remember those years ago. Well, it wasn't so goddamn long ago either when I was going to school, high school. Those trains that go through town, and I'll bet there'd be 2 or 3 or 4 hobos on every goddamn car. And I don't know if I don't think they would, if the people that worked for the railroad caught them, I think they made them get off. But if you had those people going through, you sure the hell didn't want to have to dump them off in your town, because then what were you going to do with them? most of those people were broke and looking for a job.
Did you stay at the hotel when you came down for school?
Nope. We got that little house that Mrs. Cockrell had. I don't know who's living in that now.
One that Justin has is right by the bank.
Oh.
It's
Across, not too far from the Lutheran church.
that Cockrell house is the one that gentleman has got to. It's got his garden in the middle of his yard. But there was a little house there, and we came down and we started batching there. One of the things I remember, if you got kids batching, it don't take long to get acquainted in town because they get to be quite a hangout. So.
So would you have gone to high school in the old two-story brick building?
Yep. In fact, I think I was on the school board when we finally decided that it had wore out its usefulness and built a new school.
Evidently, when they tore down the old school, they didn't haul all of it away. They must have just buried it.
They opened everything up, the contractor, and then he just backed off and let people tear apart and take out what the hell ever they wanted, so they wouldn't have so much stuff to to move out of there.
We built a greenhouse back behind where the shop is probably 5 years ago, and we were digging a foundation for it, and we ran into the old foundation of what must have been the gym.
Oh,
And go through that, and there was rebar and everything still in there.
well, that gym shouldn't be, is that where you put that, right back at the school shop there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would have been
Well,
behind.
the gym would have been further east. There used to be a coulee that came down through there. That was where the problem was. They built the old gym on top of that coulee, and they didn't do a decent job of compacting that. And then as over years, that thing kept settling there on the east side. I don't know what that rebar would have been back over on that side.
I don't know. We got it done though.
Yeah.
Well, wasn't the cafeteria part of all that concrete?
The what?
The cafeteria? Seemed like there was a lot of concrete on the north side of the cafeteria.
Well, I suppose they had to do something with it. Maybe they just pushed it over the edge. Shouldn't have been any buildings back there, I don't think. Oh, unless that was the old BN pumping station used to be there. And during the days of the steam engine, they pumped water. They had, I don't know, a half dozen great big wooden tanks in there, and they had to soften that water before they could use it in the steam engine. So the guy that done that might have been part of where that BN thing set, because there was pretty good sized buildings back in there.
Did you have any good memories of high school?
Well, not really. When we were going to school, you never got to school till harvest was over in the fall. And then as soon as seeding started in the spring, well, then that was cut the end of it off. So it was always short about probably 2 months of high school. So it was all damn hard to get caught up is what I remember. and kids were too busy on the farm. I don't remember ever playing basketball.
Who were some of the kids in your class?
The kids? Well, I don't know if you knew the Morehouse family. If you were in school, you had a Morehouse in your class.
Oh, so like the Macaulays now.
Well, well, the Macaulays never had as darn many as the Morehouse. I think Morehouse had a dozen kids.
Oh, wow.
And Dale, that one that started D&G down there, he was in my class, and he used to work for us when he was a kid, so. Yeah, when we were up north, you added, there was 5 families up there, and we had 27 kids. And nobody knew they had a big family either. Well, those country schools, I don't have any real fond memories of those things at all. And every year you got a different teacher, and some of them were fair, and I don't ever remember having a good one, but I remember having a lot of poor ones, so you couldn't learn anything at those things if you tried.
Did any of the teachers use switches or anything? You have any of the rough teachers?
Well, if you got out of line, you went down to superintendent, and he took care of you. And you were usually fairly careful. You didn't have to go through that. Well, when I started high school, of course that was during the war, and all of the good teachers, the men teachers, were all in the service. So we wound up with a bunch of cripples and has-beens in there, and some of them never was, and they drug a bunch of teachers out of retirement, and I felt totally sorry for them because they had no control over the kids of any kind, so.
So did the war end before you got out of high school or after?
I guess that's about the time that's as far as I went. All of a sudden we had a farm to run, so that was the end of school. I got about halfway through my sophomore year, and that was as far as school went. As far as I was concerned, when I was going to high school, to me that was all vacation, because if you were home, you damn well had something to do.
So when did you guys start expanding the ranch? Because you guys used to have a really big outfit, didn't you?
Well, it was later years, I guess. We bought a ranch there in Phillips County, the Woodkey place, and that was added on. We already had quite a bit of range in that country anyway, and then later years we wound up when Wellington Rankin, I don't know, does that name mean anything to you? Well, he bought some of the best ranches in the whole goddamn state. And he had this stuff out east of town here that we had. And then he had what they call the VLM south of Malta, and there was and that one that Locke wound up with down on the Missouri. I never did understand what he was buying those ranches for, and most of those he never put foot on even. He had a guy that was kind of the roaming foreman, and he's the one that took care of them, and he had some of the goddamnedest messes that you can possibly imagine. That one year, he had this, he'd bought part of John David's stuff up north of Glasgow. That was part of the Kerr place. And well, he had that stuff up there. He must have had 1,000 head. And there wasn't any water, there wasn't any fences, there wasn't any feed. And those things, they finally broke out of that country and started south. And I don't know who all they came through. Part of that would have been British, I suppose, and Cornwells and a half a dozen other. Well, when they finally got down to the highway, the patrol was down there. They were trying to get them off the highway, and anybody that lived along the highway there were standing out in their fence, making goddamn sure they didn't turn them into their place, because they didn't want a bunch of hungry cows, and those things were starving to death. And that later in the year, Jack Rosendahl was one of them. I think he was out here on the bottom, and they had a bunch of hay put up, Rankin's crew, and they had no idea how to build a fence or anything. And in order to save time and space, they built the goddamn fence right against the edge of the stack. Well, I don't know if you're aware of what happens then. The cow starts eating through it, and it isn't very long, they're on top of the stack. Well, when we took that place over out here, I don't know how many of those messes that I had to clean up to get back to the dirt again even. All kinds of goddamn wire fence and posts and cow manure and bones, and I don't know how many head of stuff they lost out there. Rankin finally decided he'd ship a bunch of that stuff to California. And why the hell the railroad ever let him do that? When I was one of them in town here, and we were going through that stuff that was coming in from out there on the bottom, and anything we wanted to check the brand on, those things were so weak, you could take a couple of guys and push them over against the fence and take a clipper and clip the brands if you were wondering what the brand was on them. So,
oh, wow.
Well, anyway, and I don't know how many carloads of stuff he loaded in town here and shipped to California. Well, if I would imagine that the railroad probably paid for about 25% of those things, I would imagine they probably weren't alive by the time. And I don't know what he was going to do with them in California. I never did hear. Well, you must have heard of the Rankin name.
Mm-hmm. As you were telling that story, it sounded familiar. He was related to Dannette Rankin, wasn't he? And I think he had a big place down there in Marr County.
Well, he had stuff all over the state. Well, his sister, Dannette Rankin, you must have heard of her.
Mhm.
She's the one that voted against the entry of the United States getting into World War One, and she also voted against to get into World War Two. She served, I don't know, 2 or 3 terms, I think. And Wellington was always wanting to get into politics, but Jeanette's name was so bad for voting against getting into the war, I think that kept her from ever getting into politics. But I can't imagine buying all those places and never taking the most of those places that he bought had good living quarters and everything on. And by the time he'd had them 2 or 3 years ago, them cows were in the house, and Agnes and I were coming through, I think it was Ringling one time. I don't know where it is. It's west or east of Helena, there someplace, and there was a whole bunch of fence along the highway that the cows were walking through, and a bunch of goddamn buildings that the cows were in, and I was driving along, and pretty soon I see some double old bar cows, and I don't know, that was one of the places that Rankin had bought that I recognized, so.
How did the breed of cattle change in the country over the year? Did everyone start out with like Herefords or?
Well, I can tell you how they all got in the Hereford business. Everybody had milk cows, and they bought pretty good Hereford bulls and run with these milk cows, and after 3 or 4 generations, you had a halfway decent looking critter. And you probably don't remember, but anything that you went to sell, they call them linebacks, because they'd have a white hair down the back, and that was just about 90% chance they were out of a milk cow brand someplace. and that, one of the big advantages to that is as long as those cows had some milk cow blood in them, they were pretty good milkers. And that went along a number of generations, and then finally, once you got that milk cow strain all of them, then the goddamn things got where they weren't giving any decent milk. And that's when the people started going into the Angus, I guess. Yeah, Steve Holman up here, he was selling Hereford bulls, the thing I can remember about him. And he had a pretty goddamn productive place that he was on. And then he went to Denver, I think it was, and bought, I think, one of the highest priced bulls that was ever in this country. Which was fine and dandy. The only thing of it was, this bull had dwarfism built into it. And nobody at that time even knew what the hell it was. If you'd been using Holman's bulls for 2 or 3 generations, it takes, the cow's got to have that gene in her, and so does the bull, in order before you wind up with an actual dwarf. I remember we had a few of them, and after those bulls started throwing those dwarf calves, I think that about pulled Steve Holman out of the bull business. So.
Do you remember the old Legion Hall?
Well, I never was to a show in the thing, but I remember being through a lot of dances at that thing when I was a kid. And then they had a roller skating deal going in there for once in a while, for 1 year or 2 or 3. There was an outfit that come in, I guess, and they rented roller skates. I don't imagine they'd done the floor any good in there, but
I heard someone say that they had some of these really big curtains and they would have advertisements on them.
well, they did. They used to have an outfit that come through. I think they call them the Dre Company, and they put a play on, and then after the play, there must have been musicians in this outfit, and then they put a dance on. I remember going to a few of those plays, I guess. I don't remember anything about them, but in fact, I can remember when them circuses used to come into Hinsdale.
Were you around when they had the elephant?
Oh yeah, I think pretty all of those circuses had to have elephants, so that was the main attraction. Most of those farm kids had never seen one, so.
Where would they set up the circus?
Well, there used to be a vacant lot. It would have been south of the old Legion Hall. From there over to the post office that Stubbs Rudder had, and there must have. That's the only place I can remember setting up. I guess was right there. Most of that's under the school now.
Did you ever get to ride the train?
We used to go anytime there was a tournament in town. A lot of times the tournaments were at Wool Point. And the only way you had to get to Wool Point was take the damn train down there. So we rode the skidoo. A whole bunch of us kids would get on the thing and stay over, I don't remember, 3 days or whatever the tournament was.
Do you remember the old train depot?
Oh yeah. The steam engine was still coming through when I was a kid. And some of us kids wouldn't have anything to do later in the evening, and we'd go over and BS with the depot agent because he'd be sitting there with nothing to do. So he'd put up with those kids, I guess.
Do you remember when it burned?
Yep, I do. So, and there was a guy that, what the hell did he do? He knew there was the bank had a shipment of cash coming in, so he went over to the depot and picked this stuff up and then set the depot on fire to cover up the crime. So, well, he'd been a depot operator. This guy, I don't even remember now what his name was.
Was it Stuff?
Nope.
Oh, okay.
Stuff was he was the elevator operator.
Trying to remember, I was just talking to David Hillman about this yesterday. I want to say it was like Eddie, but I can't remember what the guy's name was. He gave me some papers on it.
No,
I want to say the guy's name was Eddie, but that's probably wrong.
I guess I wouldn't know who that would.
But he figured he could get away with it, huh?
Well, he did for a little while. He went up to, I think he took a job on the railroad up to Whitewater. And he was up there for a little while. Well, Bud Hillman was managing the bank at that time, and he said, I knew just exactly who had robbed that thing. He said, well, he could tell by he said the guy that had bills he couldn't pay, and all of a sudden he started paying his bills, and, and there was a few other things, and Bud said, I knew goddamn well just exactly, and when the railroad was investigating it, well, they were positive it wouldn't be one of their own men that would have did the robbing, so Bud said they wouldn't listen to me. But anyway, they finally got this guy to admit, I guess, that he was a thief in the thing.
When did you meet Agnes?
Well, the first time I remember her, Harvey Jones furnished the car, and I think a friend of mine by the name of Buck Gosh and somebody else, we went up to Seika to the show, and Agnes was a little goddamn kid at that time, is all I remember. There was another story that Sid Simons and I got involved in years ago. Sid and I were on the elevator board, and Ed Swanson. And Ed called me up one day and wanted to know if I'd seen Wilbur. Wilbur's stuff was her manager. And I said, yeah. I said, I talked to him yesterday. He was the clerk of the school board, and I was on the school board up at Genevieve, so I talked to Wilbur about school business. Well, I told Edwin, I said, I talked to him, and he seemed kind of despondent at the time. I said, he was talking about committing suicide and everything else. So, well, anyway, this was on a Sunday, I guess. So Monday, Sid and I go over. We had to break into the elevator because Wilbur had taken the keys. So we got in and we dumped the waste paper basket out. And Wilbur he owed everybody. He hadn't paid any bills for, Christ, I don't know how long. He owed on the washer and the dryer and the kids' teeth, and I don't remember what the hell else. Well, I remember telling Ed and Sid both, I said, this don't look good to me. Well, anyway, we were short a bunch of local receipts. I don't know what it was, $200 or $300 worth. Well, anyway, we finally we hired another elevator operator because Wilbur was gone, and you have to have somebody. So, of course, then you got to weigh the elevator up. Well, we were all of a sudden we get the envelope from Scobie or someplace, and a bunch of these receipts were in that, checks and whatnot. Wilbur got up there and either got scared to cash them, either that or he wanted to make people think that he went to Canada or something. Well, anyway, I thought, well, perhaps we're not too bad a shape after all. So, when you change managers, the first thing you gotta do, you gotta have a weigh up. Because if you're a new manager, you wanna know how many, if there's supposed to be 99,000 bushel in there, there better be there. So we started weighing this, one of the bins on the east side up. And there's an automatic scale, and that's the way you check the bushel, because every time it dumped, I think I don't remember, it was 5 or 10 bushel or what it was. So we were setting, we got everything set up, and you gotta have an empty bin in the first place, I guess, so we were dumping into that. Well, after about 20 minutes or so, I think we'd just got a pinochle game started, and the goddamn automatic scale stopped dumping. So we thought it was got to be something wrong with that. Well, this guy that we'd hired, this Delroy Brecky, he jumped on the man lift and he went to the top of the elevator to check the automatic scale, and I went over on this bin that we were checking, and that had an inspection door on the bottom, was about 3 feet off the floor, and I tapped on that, and I thought, well, hell, there's no grain against it, that damn thing's empty. So I opened it up and got to looking up in there. I had a trouble light, and I see way up in the top there's some carpenter work up there. So, well, anyway, when this Brecky came back down, and I told him, I said, this bin's empty down here. Well, he said, it's full up on top. Well, this manager, as the bin went up, once it got under the roof, it got fairly narrow, and it was just right to take a goddamn grain door and put across there, and so Wilbur had a grain door on there, and he'd put about, I suppose, maybe 75 bushel on that. So if you were on the work floor and looked over, it looked like the bin was full. So anyway, I go upstairs and start probing bins. Well, that wasn't the only one that Wilbur had did some goddamn carpenter work on.
Just stole a bunch of grain from you guys, huh?
No, he never stole a goddamn bushel. And the USDA, the guy, see, at the time that was the way the elevator were living on the commodity credit grain. The elevator got so much a bushel for storing it for them. And so as far as the government was concerned, if the elevator was short 1 bushel, it was commodity credit grain because it was never segregated. So, well, anyway, all of a sudden we wound up short a whole bunch of wheat. As far as it was gone, well, this government guy come in with his briefcase and sat down at the desk there in the elevator, and he was gonna, I think everybody told him that Wilbur was a bookkeeper. I said, done through the books. Well, he said, if it's through the books, he said, it won't take me too long to figure that out. Well, anyway, he dinged around, and about 10 days later, he folded his briefcase up, and we said, oh, what'd you find out? We haven't got the faintest idea how he got rid of that wheat. Well, he wasn't stealing the goddamn wheat in the first place. What he was doing, if somebody come in, where the mistake was made, we were selling chicken feed and calf feed and salt, and anytime somebody would come in and they'd say buy $50, $75 worth of that stuff, Wilbur would just take and cash the check and stick the money in his pocket. and showed that he'd bought a pickup load of wheat, and the wheat was never there. So it was a system that he made work for a number of years. Yeah, this USDA guy, he was bound and determined, if it was in the books, it wouldn't take him long to figure it out. Well, he never did figure it out.
I think he should have figured it out within 10 days.
Well, he never did figure it out. Wilbur, I think, after he finally turned himself in and come back, and then he told the board how he'd done it, so. Well, we'd weighed the elevator up, I think, every year. If you're gonna keep track of things, you're going to have to do that. And that one year, we weighed up and we were short, I forget what it was, 700-800 bushel. Wilbur said, I know we didn't weigh that one bin up. So we go back over and run all the grain back through again, and Wilbur made it come out right the second time, so. What you do on those things, you give the goddamn manager a vacation and take his keys and said, we'll see you after we get through with this thing. You know, they should never be there when you're weighing up. That's something you learned afterward.
Yeah. Well, the rodeo's tomorrow. How many of those you been to?
I don't go to rodeos. I just don't care for them.
I don't blame you there. I've been sitting out there and get hailed on. It's like,
Well, the thing I remember when I was on the ranch, you always had some man that thought that he was a cowboy and would go riding the local rodeo, and then first thing you know, he'd get all busted up, and then you were short a man again, so.
it just meant more work for you.
Well, you had to go hire another man usually.
How many cattle was the ranch running at its peak?
Well, we must have had around 2,000 head, something like that. We had range in Phillips County, and then we had a range up there on that Rankin place. And then if we wound up with more cattle than what we had range for, then you'd have to go out and start looking around and finding grass someplace, so.
Yeah, you were talking about that Woodkey place. We kind of run the cows up there now, and that's some rough country.
Well, that's as good a grass country, cow country as you want to get into, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, there's probably grass up there that still hasn't been touched by a cow in a long time in some of those little coulees.
Well, do they use much of that grass on the east side of the creek at all?
Yeah, what we usually do is we usually start up, kind of unload them there at the Peck place, and start up on top on the Little Snake Creek and then dump them down. But I
Yeah,
don't know how far north, in that northeast part, I don't think they use much at all.
well, that's some pretty damn rough country
Yeah.
in there, and that's a lot of that stuff is boggy.
I've about lost a horse up there before. It's scary.
Well, some of that country, if livestock got in it, I wouldn't ride in after them. I thought they can come out when they get ready to, because if you're riding the horses that are used to that country, you can't get them to cross that stuff. But if they're not used to that, they'll ride right in, and the first thing you know, they've got their goddamn nose sticking down in it, so.
Do you remember when that one lady moved that trailer house up there?
Oh, Christ, yes. I don't know if there's any of that trailer, did she finally move that trailer out of there? Or do
No,
you
that
know?
trailer stayed up there. I think, what was it, Barnard's or someone finally went up there and tore it apart
Oh.
just a few years ago. Mom's mad. That was our landmark, so we
Oh.
could see where we were.
The thing I always said, that the only thing she had up there was really a nice view. She didn't have any water, she didn't have nothing else. I think she used to pack water from what we call toe flat. You get, when you get up on top there, if you go west, you get down there 3/4 of a mile or so, there's a pretty good size, I don't know, there must be 25 acres of this thing, and there's a little reservoir on it.
Yeah, I think we call it Big Toe now, but yeah, that's a nice reservoir up on top there.
Now, I don't know where the toe flat came from, but that's what we always called it anyway.
Didn't she have a bunch of animals up there?
Well, she had a little bit of everything, I think. She had some, was it emus or some ostriches, and I don't know, it's hard telling. She wanted the county to build her a road from that site down there to the Peck place, I guess it was. So she talked to Wayne Warwick when he was a road boss, so he wanted me to take him up there to show him what the country looked like. He said, you know what, I just don't think we're going to build her a road.
Yeah, I remember when I was little, her horses and her llamas were still running around wild. I think Johnny Arnold or someone must have finally rounded up the horses. But I remember those llamas because we'd go north of the Peck place there through that bit of Arnold's until we got into Grady's and then up to where her place was. And they'd sit up on one of those buttes and they would just stare at you and they wouldn't move for 2 hours. I think they actually had a couple babies even.
I think she started out over there at the base, there at Vasco Air Force Base. She had some property over there, I guess.
But yeah, I was surprised that we had wild llamas in Montana for a while. I think they finally died out in one of those dry years, but they were even reproducing. It was kind of interesting.
I guess I must have seen them when I was still riding around the country, but.
I think they always knew who was around, and if they didn't want to be seen, they weren't seen.
Well, that's possible.
Dad said that one time, and he tried to show me it, but he couldn't remember where it was. He found a perfect skeleton of one. Evidently, the coyotes never drug any of it off, and it just was just bare bones and just a perfectly laid out skeleton of a llama. I think that was maybe only a couple years before they all kind of went.
Well, she had quite a name for herself there for a while anyway.
I don't even remember what her name is. We always just called her Crazy Lady for trying to live up there with no water.
I think that's the name she picked up. And that when you mentioned the Crazy Lady, people knew who you were talking about. I don't know if she had a husband or... I got no idea what her background was.
So what's the story behind the ranch getting broken up?
Well, I guess you can't keep them operating when you don't have any money. You keep borrowing money, and you, first thing you know, you don't have enough money to pay the interest, so. And you can't borrow money to pay the interest, so that don't work out very, very long either, so.
Do you remember Maurice, or is that how you pronounce it? Maurice Arnold? Is that how you said his name?
Morris.
Morris. I don't know if I'm
Morris.
saying
Oh,
Maurice.
Christ, yes. Our kids went to school with theirs up there. Now, Morris, he was an old sheep man in the country up there. And he was county commissioner in Valley County for, Christ, he must have been over 30 years, I guess.
Oh, wow.
And when Art got in, I think he thought he was gonna last that long too, but I think he served one term, and I think that was all people wanted of him, so.
I read somewhere that the North Bridge is named after him.
Yeah, it is. Well, here's the one that finally talked the state into come up with enough money to build that bridge, and then they built that oil road up there a couple miles south of McCauley's, I guess, where they ended it, so.
Was Gentoff Olson still living in the North Country when you were a kid?
Who?
Gentoff Olson?
Well, fairly well. He finally went down there to the Nelson Reservoir and put up a little shack down there. And then he used to come into Hinsdale, and he'd buy those old pickups, and then he'd put campers on them. In fact, I think he had 2 or 3. The idea of that was he was going to build a half a dozen of those in Hinsdale, and then when he got the need satisfied, well, then he was going to go to Saco and start up again up there and get some more. He had a good idea, but everything he did was pretty crude, so. Well, he was about the last horse farmer in that country. He did finally get I think a little Ford tractor, but up till that time he was still driving a bunch of goddamn snaky horses that wasn't too unusual to see a goddamn bunch of dust going across the prairie and 2 or 3 or 4 horses in it, and Jennifer running along behind trying to catch them, so.
Now I'm trying to remember, but I think my family, the Qualleys, and quite a few of the other families up there were from Kindred, North Dakota. Does that sound familiar?
Not really.
It sounds like a lot of those people kind of moved over in bunches, because I think like when Albert Nelson and them came over, I think they came about 10 families all from the same area.
I'm not sure where Albert was from. I don't I'm not sure whether Albert was a Norwegian either. He might have been. Them I should know too, because he homesteaded in that country up there, but
almost all of them must have been Norwegian, huh?
who's that?
Were a lot of them Norwegian?
Well, depends on where they came from. A lot of them that moved into that country originated from Kindred, North Dakota. So, I guess Kindred's in North Dakota, is it?
Yeah. Do you remember anyone talking about the Snake Creek school fire?
Oh yeah. They had just built that building. It was brand new and they were having a kind of a dedication party for it. And I think they had just about everybody in the country attended the thing. And those old schools had a kind of a entryway on one side of it, and there was two doors getting a door on this side and a door on that side for people to get into, and then there was one in the middle to get out. Well, they must have had a goddamn coffee making machine back there, fire going in a way, and the goddamn thing, something happened to it and it caught fire, and that burned up. I think Swalheim's lost a boy in that fire, and Tom Pritchard lost his wife, and I'm not sure if there was any more died in that fire or not. Well, then after that they decided they should put a back door in all the schools, so so that was one thing that got done.
Yeah, second door was definitely a good idea.
Well, absolutely, yeah. I would imagine that the fire marshal people would have insisted on that if they would have known about it.
I was reading some old newspaper clippings from the Seco Independent, and they had some Genevieve news on there. And it said that there was a couple boys that found this old dynamite shack and tried to blow themselves up with the dynamite caps, about lost their eyes.
Well, that's not exactly the way the story goes. A guy by the, I think Denzel Morse, he was an old working man around that country up there, and he blowed all the fingers off except one on one hand. And I don't, as far as I know, I think that was the only dynamite accident I think I remember hearing about.
Was there quite a bit of dynamite people just had?
Well, Fred's dad always had dynamite because when he was mining coal, he was using dynamite to get the dirt loose so that it'd uncover the coal. So that dynamite used to come in sticks about 10 inches long or so and about that big around, and you could buy a case at a time, and we always had some dynamite around. You were blowing out springs or doing something to use it in a way.
Do you remember the old fire extinguishers they had that were made of glass and they had the carbon tetrafluoride in it?
Well, I don't remember them being glass. Well, there was another different Christ, there was a salesman around the country, and he was selling those things. They were made out of glass. And you hung them up or some goddamn thing, and then when a fire started, if it touched that glass, well, it broke the glass and let this stuff out of it. I guess that's probably what you're talking about.
I just remember hearing that they were so dangerous because they pulled all the oxygen out of the air.
Well, I'm sure if you would have been in the room with them and one of those would have break, it wouldn't have been too long before you wind up running out of oxygen.